Have you ever wondered what happens when people are pushed for too long, when their voices are ignored, and their hopes are silenced? This is the story of a nation that refused to be quiet. A story of courage, struggle, and the long road to freedom. Let's take a gentle journey through the history of the Algerian War, a story that still echoes today. Algeria had been under French colonial rule since 1830. When the French first invaded, they took over the land by force, and over the years Algeria became deeply tied to France, not just as a colony, but as part of France itself. However, the local Algerian population, who were mostly Muslim, faced great inequalities. French settlers, known as Pieds Noirs, were given special privileges. They owned most of the land and controlled the government and economy. Meanwhile, Algerians were often pushed aside. Many Algerians worked in low-paying jobs, and they did not have the same rights as the French settlers. They could not vote in the same way, and their voices were mostly ignored by the political system. Over time, this unfair treatment caused great tension. Algerians began to feel that their country no longer belonged to them. They were expected to follow rules set by others, and their culture, religion, and traditions were often looked down upon by the colonial rulers. The schools favored French language and ideas, and many young Algerians grew up feeling disconnected from their own history. The situation grew worse after World War II. Many Algerian soldiers had fought for France during the war, and they returned home hoping for better treatment. But instead, they found the same injustices waiting for them. Protests began to spread across the country, with people calling for equal rights and freedom. However, these protests were often met with violence and repression by the authorities. The frustration continued to grow as Algerians saw little change in their daily lives. Many began to believe that peaceful protests would not be enough. The idea of fighting for independence started to take root, and soon, movements for freedom became stronger and more organized. Setting the stage for a larger struggle ahead, on November 1, 1954, a new chapter in Algerian history began. This day is remembered as the start of the Algerian War of Independence. It was a carefully chosen date by a group called the National Liberation Front, also known as the FLN. The FLN was formed by Algerian nationalists who believed that armed struggle was the only way to achieve freedom from French rule. They were inspired by years of injustice, discrimination, and broken promises from the French government. On that night, the FLN carried out a series of coordinated attacks across Algeria. These attacks targeted police stations, military posts, communication lines, and other symbols of French authority. The goal was not just to cause damage, but to make a strong political statement. They wanted the world and France to know that Algerians were serious about gaining their independence. The French government was shocked by these attacks. In response, they declared a state of emergency and sent more soldiers to Algeria. The war quickly escalated, with the French military determined to crush the rebellion. The FLN, however, was not a traditional army. It relied on guerrilla warfare, using surprise attacks and blending in with local populations. They operated in both cities and rural areas, making it hard for the French to stop them completely. The FLN also worked to gain the support of Algerian villagers, many of whom were already frustrated with colonial rule. Over time, the FLN's message spread widely across Algeria. They promised not just freedom, but also dignity, justice, and a new future where Algerians could govern themselves. The first attacks on November 1st became known as the Toussaint Rouge or Red All Saints' Day, marking the beginning of an 8-year struggle that would transform Algeria forever. The Algerian War was marked by intense guerrilla warfare and brutal repression. The National Liberation Front, or FLN, did not have the weapons or the resources to fight a conventional war against the powerful French army, so they used guerrilla tactics. This meant they carried out sudden attacks, bombings, and ambushes, often targeting police officers, soldiers, and even civilians who were seen as supporting the French rule. They moved through the mountains, forests, and cities, striking quickly and then disappearing. This type of warfare was difficult for the French to counter because the fighters blended in with local populations, making it hard to tell who was a rebel and who was not involved in the conflict. In response, the French military launched harsh crackdowns. They arrested thousands of people suspected of supporting the FLN, often with little or no evidence. Villages were burned down, and entire communities were displaced. One of the most famous and violent episodes during the war was the Battle of Algiers between 1956 and 1957. During this time, FLN fighters carried out bombings in the city of Algiers, targeting cafes, offices, and public places. The French authorities responded with a brutal counterinsurgency campaign led by the French army's paratroopers. They used extreme methods, including torture, to extract information from prisoners. Many people were arrested and never seen again. These brutal tactics caused deep fear and trauma among the Algerian population, but also drew international criticism. Despite the violence, the FLN continued its fight, and their determination began to inspire more Algerians to join the cause. The war became not only a military struggle, but also a psychological battle, with both sides trying to win the hearts and minds of the people, while leaving lasting scars on Algerian society. As the Algerian War dragged on, it began to attract widespread international attention. The conflict was no longer seen as just a local rebellion. It became a global issue, raising questions about colonialism, freedom, and human rights. Many countries in Africa and Asia, which were also fighting against colonial powers or had recently gained independence, expressed strong support for the Algerian struggle. These nations saw Algeria's fight as part of a larger movement against colonialism worldwide. Neighboring countries, such as Morocco and Tunisia, which had recently gained their independence from France, provided safe havens and support for Algerian fighters. These countries allowed FLN fighters to train and regroup within their borders, which made it harder for France to contain the conflict. At the same time, the war became a major topic at the United Nations. Algeria's representatives and supporters raised their voices, demanding international intervention and urging countries to recognize the Algerian right to self-determination. The FLN also worked hard to gain international sympathy by sending delegations abroad, explaining their cause to foreign governments and media outlets. They portrayed their struggle not just as a rebellion but as a fight for justice, freedom, and human dignity. As reports of torture, mass arrests, and civilian casualties spread through the press, more people around the world began to question France's actions in Algeria. Protests against the war took place in several European countries, and even within France, public opinion started to shift. Intellectuals, students, and activists began speaking out against the war, criticizing the government's harsh measures and calling for a peaceful resolution. This growing pressure from the international community, combined with the rising costs of the war, pushed the French government to reconsider its position, leading to greater interest in negotiating an end to the conflict. By 1958, the Algerian War had deeply divided France, both politically and socially. The violence in Algeria was spilling over into French politics, causing great instability. Many in France were tired of the long, costly war, but others, especially the French settlers living in Algeria, strongly opposed any idea of Algerian independence. These settlers, known as Pieds-Noirs, feared losing their homes, land, and privileged status if Algeria became independent. The political crisis reached a peak when the French government began to collapse under pressure from both military leaders and angry settlers. In May 1958, a major uprising by French settlers and army officers in Algeria threatened to overthrow the French government unless something was done to keep Algeria French. Fearing civil war, the government called on Charles de Gaulle, a respected leader from World War II, to return to power. He agreed, but demanded special powers to solve the crisis. Many hoped de Gaulle would continue fighting to keep Algeria under French rule, but, as he assessed the situation, he began to see the war as unwinnable. He realized that holding on to Algeria through force would only lead to more violence and division. Over time, de Gaulle slowly shifted his position, first offering limited self-rule and later suggesting the possibility of full independence. His changing stance angered many settlers and military leaders, some of whom attempted rebellions against him. However, de Gaulle remained firm, believing that peace was more important than maintaining the colony. His leadership marked a major turning point in the conflict, as he opened the door to serious negotiations with the FLN. While some viewed his decisions as betrayal, others saw them as a necessary step toward ending the long and painful war that had cost so many lives on both sides. After years of devastating war, both France and Algeria were growing weary of the ongoing violence. The cost of the conflict had become too high, not only in terms of money but also in human lives and political stability. Under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle, France gradually moved toward finding a solution through negotiation. Secret talks began between French officials and the National Liberation Front, even while fighting continued in many parts of Algeria. These talks were difficult, as both sides had strong demands and deep distrust toward each other. However, they finally led to the signing of the Evian Accords in March 1962. The agreements included a ceasefire, the promise of a referendum to let Algerians decide their future, and arrangements for the protection of French settlers who wished to remain in Algeria. When the ceasefire took effect, many Algerians were relieved, but violence did not stop immediately. Some extremist groups, especially among the French settlers, continued to resist the agreements through bombings and attacks. Despite these last efforts to block independence, the referendum was held in July 1962, and the result was overwhelming. Nearly all Algerians voted in favor of independence. On July 5, 1962, Algeria officially became an independent nation, ending 132 years of French colonial rule. People celebrated in the streets with joy, waving flags and singing songs of freedom. However, the country also faced many challenges ahead. The war had left deep scars, and thousands of people had been killed or displaced. Many French settlers fled the country, leaving behind homes and businesses. Still, for the Algerian people, independence represented hope. It was a victory that symbolized their long struggle for dignity, justice, and the right to govern themselves. Algeria had entered a new era, free but carrying the heavy memories of its painful past. The story of the Algerian War is a reminder of how deeply people can long for freedom, and how much they are willing to endure to achieve it. It shows how the desire for dignity, justice, and self-rule can grow stronger through years of hardship and struggle. From the first sparks of rebellion to the long, painful battles, from international voices calling for peace to leaders making difficult choices, every part of this history speaks to the power of determination. In the end, Algeria's independence was not just the result of political decisions or military victories. It was the result of hope that refused to fade, even in the darkest times. This story teaches that no matter how long a struggle may last, the dream of freedom can inspire people to stand together, to face challenges, and to build a new beginning with courage and unity.